The van jolted so hard I thought my teeth might crack. Every bump in the cracked road rattled my bones and sent a sharp jolt through my wrists where the cuffs dug into skin already rubbed raw. The air inside smelled like old metal, sweat, and something sour I couldn't name. I had never known fear had a scent until that moment. It clung to the walls, pressed down on my chest, made my breath shallow. I stared at the floor. Scuffed steel, sticky in spots, streaked with rust. I tried not to think about who else had sat chained to this bench before me, where they were now, what they had done. My throat burned with dryness, and a cough escaped, sharp and ugly. The man chained beside me didn't look up. None of them did. Everyone kept their heads down, eyes hidden, as if eye contact itself might be dangerous. This wasn't supposed to be my life. I had never been in real trouble before, never even gotten a speeding ticket. And yet here I was, cuffed, chained, transported like property. Shame burned hotter than the fear at first. The memory of my arrest played on repeat. How my neighbors had peeked through curtains as the officers led me away. How the handcuffs had clicked shut while I stammered useless protests. I couldn't even think about what would come after. All I could feel was the steel biting my skin. The way each bump in the road reminded me that I wasn't in control of anything anymore. When the van screeched to a stop, the sound of metal against metal made my stomach flip. A heavy clang echoed as the back doors swung open. Daylight cut in like a blade, blinding after the dim interior. "Move!" a guard barked, voice sharp through the visor of his helmet. We shuffled forward, chains clinking, ankles dragging. My feet felt leaden. And then I saw it. The prison walls rose above me, gray and unyielding, a fortress of concrete and iron. High fences coiled with razor wire gleamed under the pale sun. It looked less like a building and more like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. My throat tightened. I forced myself to swallow, but it felt like glass sliding down. Inside the gates, the noise hit me first. Shouts, crude laughter, the clang of metal doors. The air smelled of bleach and sweat, layers of humanity pressed together with no escape. Guards ordered us into a line, rifles slung over their shoulders. Their faces stayed hidden behind dark visors, unreadable, as though they weren't even human. Processing was a blur. They stripped away everything I'd carried with me. My watch, wallet, shoes gone. The clothes I had chosen that morning, thinking maybe they'd give me some dignity, were pulled away like rags. I stood exposed under harsh fluorescent lights, my skin crawling with humiliation. They handed me a thin uniform that smelled faintly of mildew, rough against my skin. I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. Around me, other men shuffled through the same ritual. Some looked hardened, eyes flat, movements efficient. They had done this before. Others trembled, voices cracking as they answered questions, fear radiating off them like heat. I tried to disappear into myself, to shrink until I was invisible. And that's when I saw him. He leaned against the far wall, arms crossed over a chest built like stone. His presence filled the room without a word. The other inmates gave him space, an invisible circle of respect or fear I couldn't tell. His expression was unreadable. Not cruel, not kind, just calm in a way that made the air around him heavy. My eyes met his for a fraction of a second. A chill crawled up my spine. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply looked, and in that look, I felt stripped bare in a way the guards hadn't managed. It was as if he knew something about me I hadn't even admitted to myself. Something dangerous, something binding. "Move along," a guard snapped, yanking me back into the line. My breath caught as I stumbled forward, but I couldn't stop replaying that glance. The hours that followed blurred together. Shouted orders, endless instructions, doors slamming behind us until it felt like the world had shrunk to concrete and bars. Every sound made me flinch. The clanging gates, the distant screams, the mocking laughter. Survival here meant learning quickly, and fear, I realized, was its own kind of armor. But no armor felt thick enough when the cell door finally shut behind me with a metallic thud. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy, the air stale. My hands trembled as I ran them over the coarse fabric. Somewhere beyond the walls, men shouted, laughed, cursed. I could hear footsteps echoing down the corridor, guards' keys jangling. And beneath it all, a single thought pulsed, relentless. I wasn't going to make it through the night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the fluorescent bulb flickering overhead. My chest tightened with every sound, every shadow that passed by the small window in the door. Fear clawed at my throat until breathing felt like drowning. And behind the fear, another image rose, him. The man leaning against the wall, calm, commanding, untouchable. I hated that my mind clung to that look, to the strange chill it sent down my spine. I hated that a tiny, irrational ember of hope sparked inside me, whispering that if he had noticed me once, maybe I wouldn't be invisible. Maybe I wouldn't be alone. But as the noises of the prison swelled around me, one truth pressed in with suffocating clarity. My life, as I had known it, was over. I was trapped in a world where every glance carried a threat, where weakness was a target. And I wasn't sure I would survive long enough to understand what that man's look really meant. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself asleep. But sleep didn't come. Only the gnawing certainty remained. Tomorrow might be worse. Tomorrow I might not survive. The second day hit harder than the first. At least yesterday, shock had numbed me, blunted the edges of what was happening. By morning, that numbness was gone, replaced by the raw scrape of reality. The guards barked orders at dawn. Metal doors clanged open, and we were shoved into line, herded like cattle down echoing hallways. My stomach growled, empty and sour, but I dreaded the cafeteria more than hunger itself. It wasn't just a place to eat. It was a test. The noise slammed into me before I even stepped inside. Trays clattering, men shouting across long tables, laughter too sharp to be friendly. The smell was worse. A mix of greasy food, sweat, and bleach that turned my stomach. I kept my eyes low, clutching the tray they shoved into my hands like a shield. I thought if I stayed small, no one would notice me. I was wrong. Halfway to an empty spot, a body slammed into my side. My tray tipped, food sliding across the cracked linoleum. Laughter erupted, loud and mocking, like hyenas circling prey. "Watch where you're going, fresh meat." The man sneered, his grin wide, teeth yellow. He was bigger than me, thicker arms, tattoos curling up his neck. Heat rushed to my face. My hands trembled as I bent down to pick up the mess, but a boot nudged the tray away, sending peas rolling across the floor. More laughter. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the ground to open and swallow me whole. Then I felt it, a heavy hand on my shoulder. Firm, unshakable. I froze. When I looked up, it was him. The man I'd seen in processing, leaning against the wall as if the world couldn't touch him. His eyes were steady, dark, unreadable. He wasn't smiling. "Back off," he said. The words weren't loud, but the weight in his voice made the air shift. The laughter died down. The bully's smirk faltered. He looked between us, something like fear flickering across his face, then muttered under his breath and backed away. The hand lifted from my shoulder, leaving behind a ghost of heat and pressure. I turned toward him, throat tight, heart hammering. "I can handle myself," I stammered, though the lie sounded weak even to me. He didn't argue. He just studied me, silent, eyes scanning as if measuring me in ways I couldn't understand. Then he leaned closer, his voice low, dangerous, final. "You're mine now." The words dropped like chains around my chest. I blinked. "What?" His jaw tightened. "You're mine. From now on, you answer to me." My mouth opened, panic surging. "No, Shoo." The sound was almost soft, but it carried steel. "Don't fight it. Not here. Not yet." The cafeteria had gone eerily quiet. I could feel eyes on me, dozens of them, watching, waiting, whispering. Some curious, some fearful, some, I realized with a jolt, respectful. And then he turned, just like that, walked away with the same calm dominance, leaving me frozen, my chest tight, my tray still empty. The rest of the day blurred. Showers were worse than I had imagined. The smell of mildew clung to the tile. Water trickled in weak streams. Men joked and jeered, shoulders bumping too close, stares lingering too long. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, soap slipping in my hands, skin prickling with vulnerability. But nothing happened. Not to me, because he was there, leaning casually against the far wall, arms crossed, gaze sweeping over the room like a watchtower. The men around me glanced his way, then looked elsewhere. No one touched me. No one spoke to me. In the yard later, I tried to find a corner, some place to breathe. But even there I felt it, his presence, always on the edge of my vision, always near enough to be noticed, never far enough to ignore. By the time the cell door closed that night, I was shaking with exhaustion. My body was safe, untouched, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. "You're mine now." The words replayed over and over, heavy and sharp. What did they mean? Protection? Possession? Something darker? I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. Every sound outside, the clang of metal, the distant shouts, made me flinch. But the louder sound was inside my head, the echo of his voice, calm and absolute. He had claimed me, and though terror knotted my stomach, though I hated the way those words pressed into me like a brand, I couldn't deny the other feeling that crept beneath the fear. A strange, dangerous flicker of safety. He was there before I learned to look for him. At first it felt like coincidence. A shadow folding into the corner of the yard, a silhouette at the edge of the laundry room, a shape that slid into the processing line with the same casual ease, as if the place belonged to him. Then the coincidences stopped feeling accidental. He was there when I carried my tray, there when I bent to pick up soap in the showers, there when I hauled a basket of damp shirts toward a humming dryer. Always there, always just out of reach. Prison has a way of teaching you the obvious slowly. The first obvious thing I learned was that visibility is weakness. Keep your head down. Walk with purpose even if you do not have it. Don't let anyone read the shape of your thoughts in your shoulders. He taught the rest without raising his voice. He corrected the way I walked once, a barely perceptible nudge at my elbow as if to align me in the flow of the yard. He folded his hands once over mine when I fumbled with a shoelace that had been handed back to me. Small corrections that felt like instruction, like a teacher adjusting a posture one finger at a time. He did not explain. He demonstrated. The rules were concrete and simple. Never walk alone where corners cut into shadows. Keep your tray close to your chest and your chin lower than your shoulders. When someone steps into your space, do not look surprised. Show them you have already chosen your stance. If you spill something, do not flinch. If someone laughs, do not beg for eyes that might never be kind again. When you speak, speak in short statements. Short statements minimize risk. Other men watch for patterns more than for explanation. Once you move the same way 3 or 4 times, they know what to expect. He taught me how to be predictable in a way that made me harder to target. He taught me to inhabit my body differently, to carry my fear like armor rather than air. It was a strange mentorship. Ruthless, practical, utterly without sentiment. The effect was immediate. The men who had been the first to shove and mock me began to blink at me with a new equation in their eyes. Where I had been an open, trembling target, I became something else. Claimed. They stepped around me as if they were avoiding fresh paint. Sometimes the avoidance felt like contempt, a different flavor of violence. Other times it felt like respect. Either way, it put distance between me and the worst of the insults. I hated that word, claimed. It felt like ownership, as if a hand had closed around me and labeled me an object. In a world where people were reduced to numbers and stripes, to a mess of crimes and pasts, being owned by a man inside the walls was an insult wrapped in a promise. I imagined bars painted with his handwriting and wondered whether his claim would follow me into the night in the form of threats or in the form of protection. Both possibilities terrified me. And yet safety, even the kind bought with an uneasy price, has a gravity of its own. There were nights I lay awake, heart thudding, and felt the soft outline of that safety like the seam of a coat. The knowledge that someone would step in if a fight began, that someone would make sure the laundry basket did not become an instrument of humiliation, that someone's glance could dissuade predators, that knowledge wrapped around me like a thin blanket against the cold. He was careful about how he showed it. In public he was all distance and silence, a wall set into motion. He never spoke when others were around unless he intended to impress a point. When he did speak, his words were razor-precise and final. But there were moments that were not public that shook me more than his outward power. Those moments were private and rare, held in the space where the hum of fluorescent lights dulled and the corridor seemed to hold its breath. Once, after a calloused hand had grabbed at me in the laundry room and backed away with muttered curses the moment he appeared, we ended up by the old boiler with laundry carts leaning like silent sentries. The steam painted the air thick and warm. He did not say anything at first. He watched the swirling mist and the way my shoulders shook. Then he touched my arm, not harshly, not possessively, but with a strange gentleness that made my scalp prickle. "You know how to hold yourself now," he said. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it, the kind of softness that belongs to someone speaking through a dream. "Don't let them see the cracks." I swallowed. "How do you know I'm not going to break?" He did not answer with the words I wanted. He answered with a look long enough to feel like a sentence. The look contained a memory I could not name, a shape of hurt, the geometry of a loss I would only later understand in the small scars he revealed in flashes. "You're still here," he said at last. "You're still breathing. That's the start." There it was again. In public he was a predator. In private he had a map of vulnerability and an odd sort of tenderness, limited and precise, that felt both rescuing and binding. I found that my thoughts changed around him. I stopped imagining escape as the urgent, immediate thing it had been when I first arrived. Escape became a slow arithmetic of whether freedom would erase what I had become under his watch. Would stepping through the gates mean stepping out of the safety that had been carved for me? Would it mean stepping into a world that thought the claim invalid, but no less real for that fact? Other inmates whispered. Sometimes I caught fragments. "He owns him. He's his. Don't touch. Respect the line." Those whispers moved through the block like wind under a door, stirring reactions that were protective, spiteful, curious, envious. The whispers made my name into something other than a tally in the warden's book. It was an identity articulated not by a court document but by a man's declaration. The shame was a constant companion. I would catch myself pulling at the collar of my uniform when I thought of that delicious, terrible word, mine. I would imagine my skin imprinted with it. I despised the way my stomach eased when I found he had been in the yard during the morning count. I scolded myself for the relief that nudged at the edges of my terror, as if protection and possession had become the same currency. At night, alone under the thin blanket, my breath came in uncertain waves. I played through his lessons again like a script. Keep your head down, walk with purpose, do not invite attention that is not yours to give. I replayed the private moments and the public displays. I tried to parse his silences, to take the grain of his gentleness and examine it for motives. Was it compassion, a reflection of some memory he could not let go, or a calculated tenderness meant to bind me closer? The truth settled into me like a cool, immovable stone. I was changing, not physically, no, but the architecture of my needs had shifted. I woke each morning with an inventory of small dependencies, a look that steadied me, a scent that told me he had been nearby, a quiet rule that shaped my steps. Dependency was not a thing I had expected to learn in prison, yet here it was, threading through me like a thread through fabric. I did not like it. I was ashamed of it. And I could not deny how much I had come to rely on the small mercies his claim brought me. It started in the yard, on one of those afternoons when the sun hit the concrete just right and the whole place looked more like a cage than a courtyard. The air was dry, hot enough to stick my shirt to my back. I sat on a cracked bench, pretending to watch the clouds, but really I was watching him. He leaned against the far wall, eyes narrowed, surveying the space like a hawk. He always looked like he belonged everywhere he stood. That day, though, something shifted. He didn't just stand in silence. He came closer. "Why do you sit like that?" he asked, his voice low, almost casual. I blinked. "Like what?" "With your shoulders forward. Makes you look smaller than you are." I shifted, embarrassed. "I'm not trying to look a certain way." He tilted his head. "Everyone tries, even when they don't mean to." His words lodged in me. I wanted to argue, but instead I asked, "And you? Do you always mean to look like you do?" For a second I thought I'd crossed a line. His jaw tightened, his gaze hard. Then, to my surprise, his eyes softened. "No," he said. His voice dropped even lower, as if the walls themselves weren't allowed to hear. "When I was a kid, I wanted to be invisible. I'd sneak out to a field near my house, sit there for hours just listening. Grass, wind, birds. It was the only place I didn't feel like prey." I stared at him, stunned. The image didn't fit the man I'd come to know, the predator whose silence bent others out of his way. But the way he spoke about that memory, it was almost tender. For a moment, I forgot I was in prison. For a moment, he wasn't the man who had claimed me. He was just someone remembering the world before it hardened him. And that terrified me more than anything, because the crack in his armor made me feel closer, tethered to him in a way I hadn't chosen. The confusion built slowly, day by day. His protection wasn't just power anymore. It was presence. He corrected my steps, shielded me from danger, kept me alive. But when his eyes lingered too long, when his voice slipped into softness, when I caught him watching me not like a guard but like a man, I felt something I couldn't name, something I didn't want to name. Then it happened. It was in the laundry room, late in the afternoon, the hum of machines filling the air. I was sorting uniforms when a new inmate stepped too close. His grin was sharp, the kind that promised trouble. "Fresh face," he murmured, blocking my path. "Haven't seen you around." His hand brushed against my arm. My chest tightened, stomach twisting. I stepped back, but the wall was behind me. "Don't," I whispered, though my voice shook. He leaned closer. "Relax. Nobody has to know." My throat closed. Panic flared. And then, before I could shove him away or scream, the air shifted. He was there. I didn't see him arrive. 1 second it was just me and the intruder. The next, he filled the space like a storm rolling in. His hand clamped on the man's shoulder, squeezing hard enough to make him wince. "Back off," he said, voice like steel dragged across stone. The man tried to laugh it off, but the sound broke in his throat. "Hey, I didn't mean." "You heard me." The grip tightened. The intruder hissed, shoulders hunching. Then, with a sharp shove, he was released, stumbling backward. He muttered something I couldn't catch before disappearing into the rows of machines. I stood frozen, my heart hammering so loud I could barely hear. He turned to me, eyes hard, unreadable. For a long moment he just looked at me, gaze burning. Then he said it again, the words falling heavy, inescapable. "He's mine." The echo of it filled the room, thicker than the hum of the machines. I hated it, the way it sounded like ownership, the way it stripped away choice. But under the hate, buried deep, there was something else. Relief. Felt like stepping into the shadow of a wall during a storm. It felt like knowing, for just a second, that no one could touch me without answering to him. And that frightened me more than the danger had. When I lay in my bunk that night, the thin mattress pressing against my back, the words circled in my mind. Mine. Not a plea, not a request, an absolute. I hated that it warmed me, that it quieted some part of my fear. I hated that the word gave me more comfort than the guards' locked doors, more peace than the rules I tried so hard to follow. The truth pressed in with quiet, undeniable weight. I no longer feared him the way I had on that first day. Fear was still there, yes, but it had twisted into something darker, more complicated. Something that kept me awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to name the pulse that ran through my chest every time I heard his voice. And the worst part? Somewhere deep inside, I wasn't sure I wanted to escape it. The days settled into a rhythm that felt almost merciless in its regularity. Wake, count, breakfast, work, yard, showers, head count, lights out. There was a monotony to it that flattened time, like a rolling pin pressing the hours thin. But within that flattening, a small axis held steady him. He became the one reliable variable in a world engineered to make everything else uncertain. I found myself arranging my life around him without meaning to. I chose where to sit in the yard by looking for his shadow first. If he was near the north wall, I'd sit under the sun that reached that corner. If he moved toward the laundry, I found a bench in the opposite row, close enough that I could catch the angle of his jaw in profile. It felt ridiculous to plan my day like that, to orchestrate my presence around someone else's location. And yet I did it with the same automatic ease of a muscle memory. The tiny decisions added up: when to stand, when to look down, when to smile in a way that said nothing and said everything. The rules he'd taught me had ingrained themselves into my movements. I kept my shoulders set so they wouldn't look like a target. I learned to slow my breathing when others crowded the walkway. I practiced holding my tray level with a steadiness that discouraged hands from slapping it. It was astonishing how small changes could reroute people's intentions. They saw a posture that didn't invite pity, and they, in turn, gave me a kind of space, a distance that was both courtesy and warning. That distance had a cost. While it deterred predators, it also made me invisible in a different way. The men who would have befriended me on a week two in any other place now treated me like an artifact you didn't touch. There were nods of acknowledgement from a distance, a courteous silence that said, "Don't cross this line." Sometimes I read that silence as protection. Sometimes I read it as exile. Sometimes it felt lonelier than the first night had. Friends call it compartmentalization in movies. People dividing themselves into boxes to survive. In here, I'd been boxed into one that said his, and gnawed at me. The idea that my identity could be summarized by that single possession phrase made my skin crawl. Yet there was no denying that it altered how others moved around me. Provocation that would have been directed at me seemed to slide off like rain off a roof. Men who had once been loud and brazen lowered their voices, their eyes flicking toward him. Respect, fear, or a mix of both, the effect was the same. Less danger for me. There were other effects I hadn't anticipated. People treated me with a curious mixture of deference and curiosity. They wanted to know what it meant to be the one he'd chosen. Whispers followed me through the corridors. "Did you see him with his new one? He drinks alone, don't bother him." That kind of gossip turned my presence into material, a story people consumed to feel less lonely themselves. The more they speculated, the more I felt like an exhibit rather than a person. Then there were moments of quiet that felt seismically important because they were so rare. Not grand declarations or dramatic rescues, the small, almost imperceptible contacts that carried the most weight. Once, while we were both waiting for the evening count, he reached across the small space between us and adjusted the cuff of my sleeve. It was the smallest of gestures, the kind your mother used to do when she straightened your collar before school. I flinched at the intimacy of it and then felt my heart strike a new, unfamiliar rhythm. Another time, we were in the workshop section, sanding wood for a program. My hands were rough with splinters and sawdust. I struggled with a stubborn knot, and he slid a rag into my hand without a word, fingertips brushing mine. Electricity traveled that instant between us like a current. The simplicity of the action made my breath hitch. For a second, the world shrank to the tiny place where our fingers had met. Someone walked by and I forced myself to look away, embarrassed at the heat that rose behind my ears. Those small touches were always loaded. In public he was stone. In private he was a fault line. He never asked for anything. He intervened when needed, he guided, he corrected. But the soft moments, the ones where his voice lowered and his eyes lost their predatory glint, they made me dizzy. He had the instinct to smooth my fear like one smooths a rough patch of wood until it's polished by repetition. I fought with myself over what those moments meant. Was it pity? Was it a practiced manipulation to keep me pliant? Or was it something more like care, tangled and messy the way weeds grow through cracks? My rational mind screamed it was survival calculus. My body answered in a different language. My stomach dropped when he was absent, even for an hour. My thoughts turned to him with an ache that surprised me. The ache of missing someone you have let become essential to your day. The paradox was the source of a private war inside me. On one side, I resented the way the claim diminished me, made me a thing to be possessed. On the other, I welcomed the odd sanctuary it offered. Protection here carried its own tenderness. It wasn't cheap or sentimental. It was practical and hard-edged. But the fact that it existed at all, that someone would stand between me and harm and take responsibility for that gap, softened something in me that had been brittle from fear. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying the tiny sequences of the day, the way he had scanned the yard before I sat down, the particular angle of his shoulders as he stood near the gate, the small brush of his hand across my knuckles when he handed me a cigarette he didn't smoke. I tried to analyze each motion, to write down motives like a detective mapping a case. Motives were slippery here, though. The more I probed, the less certain I became. Sometimes a dull terror still bled through. That this was temporary, that one day he could decide I wasn't worth the trouble, or that he would tire of the role he'd taken and let the world reclaim me. But alongside that terror, something else grew, insistent and bright. It was an ache that made the corners of my days feel fuller, like a cup that had been empty too long finally beginning to catch water. I realized then, with the reluctant honesty that lives in late hours, that fear had softened into another feeling entirely. It was not love in the tidy sense I'd once imagined, not the kind you see in films or read about in books. It was more complicated, threaded through with power and safety, humiliation and protection. It felt like longing, but a longing with teeth sharp, dangerous, and utterly devouring. I was ashamed when I admitted it aloud inside my head. But admitting it made something clearer. In the architecture of this place, where the rules were spoken and unspoken in the same breath, he had become not just my shield but the axis around which my days turned. I had been claimed, yes. But more than that, I was choosing, in small, perhaps cowardly ways, to stay within the circle he drew. The yard had always been a measured chaos. Bodies moving like slow current, everyone aware of their place in the tide. But that afternoon the current jolted. I had chosen a bench near the wall, the one that caught the least sun and smelled the least of disinfectant. I was folding my hands around a cup of water, trying to make myself as small as possible, when a shout cut the air. "Hey, look who it is." Fresh meat still looking like he's lost. Some voice called and several others laughed. I glanced up. A knot of men had gathered near the makeshift basketball hoop. A new crew of loud mouths, teeth and bravado, the sort of men who chewed up anyone who wandered without armor. One of them stepped forward, swaggering, and leaned in until his face was inches from mine. "You got a name? Or we just call you wife?" He spat the word like a challenge and the circle tightened. A few voices echoed it, some snickering, the air thick with anticipation. The laughter felt like stones thrown at a window you desperately wanted to see through. My chest tightened. I felt hands tremble with me. I tried to pull my legs up, to make myself disappear, but the man's hand hooked the edge of my bench and yanked me forward. The bench scraped. The world narrowed to faces and hungry grins. He jabbed a finger at my chest and the words he used were crude and precise. The crowd fed on it, voices layering into a chorus that hissed for blood. My mind pinged between panic and a dry, furious shame. I wanted to shout, "I'm not your toy." I wanted to shove him, run, anything to reclaim my body. But I had learned those moves here. They invite escalation. It was the worst kind of helplessness, the kind that makes your stomach fall and your voice a faraway echo. Then the atmosphere shifted, not with a shout or a shove, but with the simple collapse of a shadow into the space beside us. He was there, as if the air itself had carried him across the yard. The men turned reflexively, eyes flicking to him like migratory birds responding to a distant dot signal. His presence was the kind that rearranged people's shoulders, quieted bravado into a wary silence. "Back up," he said. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. The way he looked at the ringleader made the man stumble over his tough syllables. "You got something to say?" he added, voice low and slow. The ringleader tried a laugh. It didn't land. He took a half-step back, bluster drained by the fact of this man's calm. Then, almost as if the yard itself recognized a new law, the man stepped forward and pointed directly at me. The words that came out of his mouth were simple, hard as a command. "He's mine. You got that?" A hush fell hotter than any shout. The phrase landed, a sovereign declaration in a place that needed sovereigns. I felt the room tilt. The ringleader's jaw worked. He swallowed. A couple of the circle muttered under their breath and dispersed with the standoffishness of people reassessing a risk they hadn't expected. The men who had been on the fence slunk away. It was over before fists could fly. The yard resumed its business, but the air around me was different, thicker, charged, like the moment after a storm. Humiliation folded over me like a cloak and then, absurdly, a warmth. He had announced me to the yard, made me visible as something owned, and the message was unmistakable. Don't touch him. The humiliation came from being treated as property, from the word that labeled me as someone's possession. The warmth came because the label carried the guarantee of protection. I felt both stripped and shielded in the very same breath. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of his voice in the yard looped behind my eyelids. It was not just the words but the steadiness in them, the way they made others step back. I turned over until my ribs ached, needing to hear him say something, anything, in a way that made sense beyond the public claim. Finally, when the block quieted and the distant clanks of the night shift slowed to an occasional echo, I found him by the small sink in the corridor, washing his hands. The light was weak and yellow, making the hard planes of his face more like a map of lines and scars. Up close he seemed less like a force and more like a man folded into himself. "Why me?" I asked before I could swallow the words. The question came out raw. In the yard I'd felt both honored and shamed, and the tangle of emotions had a weight I could not carry alone. "Why protect me? Why claim me like that?" He paused, water running over his hands and pooling in the metal basin. For a moment he said nothing. The silence stretched, a quiet that forced a different kind of truth into being. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been in the yard. He did not look at me directly at first. He watched the water as if its movement could wash the answer clear. "Because you remind me of what I lost," he said, and the words came like a small confession, not the hard line of command I was used to. "I lost someone, a long time ago. I missed them in ways I didn't know how to hold. Seeing you—" He cut off, jaw tightening. When he looked up, there was something else in his eyes, a shadow of pain I hadn't seen before. "I'm not going to lose it again." The sentence landed with a force I hadn't anticipated. It made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I had expected selfish reasons. Power, control, use. I hadn't expected grief. I hadn't expected memory. The idea that his claim could be stitched together from loss altered it. The possessiveness threaded through it was not only about control. It was defense against some older hurt he feared to admit. It made me feel unbearably small, like a keepsake pressed into a pocket to stop a wound from reopening. But it also shifted something deeper inside me. There was a tenderness beneath the dominance, an ache that explained the rare softness and the public ruthlessness both. He had made his armor from something tender and then refused to let it go. I stood there, breath fogging the cold corridor air, trying to make sense of the confession. The thought that the man who'd claimed me could be carrying a quiet grief like mine, or like something worse, made me see his ownership in a new, destabilizing light. It didn't excuse the humiliation, but it complicated the basis of it. It introduced something human and fragile beneath the surface of the predator. When I left him by the sink, my hands felt empty. The revelation unsettled me more than any shove in the yard. I sat on my bunk, watching the thin blanket rise and fall with my breath, and the idea that his possessiveness came from a place of loss pried at my anger and replaced some parts of it with pity. I had been moving through a life of binary feelings, fear or safety, and suddenly a third color bled into the palette. I realized, with a cold sort of clarity, that this was not only protection but protection stitched together with personal history. That scared me more than the yard ever had. It meant there was something real beneath his dominance, something that might love and might hurt and might break. I lay awake, the weight of his words pressing against my ribs. The yard had seen his declaration. The corridor had seen his confession. Between the two, I felt the line between fear and something else sliding. And when sleep finally came, it did so heavy with the knowledge that whatever he felt, it was not a performance. It was rooted in memory, and that made it dangerous in a way I had not expected. News moved through the block the way mold spreads through damp bread, quietly at first, then suddenly everywhere. A paper slid across the slot of my cell one morning with a thin clack, folded and stamped. At first I thought it was another memo about counts or commissary. When I unfolded it, the words hit me like a fist. Early release. Paperwork submitted. Review pending. My hands trembled so badly the ink blurred for a second. I walked around in a daze the whole day. The yard looked the same. The cracked concrete, the same men in the same corners. But everything felt fragile, like a glass ornament teetering on a shelf. Possibility had a jagged edge. For months, freedom had been an abstract shape beyond the fences, something I kept in the back of my mind like a prayer. Now it was a form in my hands with dates and signatures. It was real, could be mine. Word spread fast. Guys who rarely spoke to me clapped me on the shoulder with gruff congratulations. Their voices clipped and awkward as if they didn't know what else to do with the news. The guards raised their brows and walked on. Even the ones who'd been cold to me carried an undertow of something that might have been hope for me. But beneath all the clumsy good-naturedness, there was a current that I hadn't expected. His watchfulness sharpened. He watched from the same places he always did, but now his eyes were not just observant, they were measuring. When I moved through the yard, I felt the angle of his head like a weight. When I sat in the workshop, he lingered a moment longer than before, as if cataloging the way I held a tool like it might be the last time he would see me do it. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. People watch each other here. But there was a tautness to him now that made the air around him thin. One afternoon he cornered me by the old library shelves where the light slotted down in bars. He didn't speak at first. He just leaned against the metal stack, arms folded, and watched me as I tried to pretend the news hadn't landed like a stone in my gut. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, the kind that did not want the walls to be aware. "You got the papers," he said. It was more observation than question. "Yes," I said. My mouth felt thick. "They filed them 2 weeks ago. My lawyer." I stopped because saying the words made them real in my mouth. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the shallow scar near his temple, the slight tremor in his jaw. "You could go," he said. "You could walk out of here." I pictured it. The gate swinging open, sunlight finally warm on skin that had known only fluorescent bulbs. I pictured my mother's face if I stepped off that bus clean and intact. Not the gaunt, tired woman who had cried the day they cuffed me. My throat constricted. "I know," I said, though the admission felt small. Silence stretched between us, and then he reached out, the gesture as deliberate as any of his pronouncements. His hand hovered at the small of my back, not touching, not possessive in the usual blunt way, but an assessment. When his fingers brushed my shirt, a shock ran through me. His eyes searched my face, as if trying to memorize what he would lose. "If you go," he said finally, voice low and strained, "you leave me. You walk through that gate and you go back to whatever life you had." He paused, and the words that followed were the sharpest I'd ever heard from him. "If you stay." He let the sentence hang, as if simply finishing it would change its meaning. He stepped even closer so that the heat of him filled the small space. "If you stay, you belong to me completely." Those words landed differently than the first time I'd heard them. Before, they had been a public claim shouted into a yard. This time they were private and devastating. A bargain offered in the dark with no paper clause and no legal counsel. One route tasted of grass and clean clothes and a life with edges I could recognize. The other offered the strange constancy of him. His protection, his presence, the small soft things he offered that were like contraband comforts in a harsh world. My stomach flipped with the impossible arithmetic of it. Freedom versus an all-consuming tether that had kept me alive. It should have been an easy calculation. Freedom. Always freedom. Leave the walls, the smallness, the labels. Yet the thought of leaving him, of leaving the debt of protection and whatever thin thread of warmth he'd woven around me, felt like stepping off a cliff and hoping to fly. He saw the conflict in my face and his features softened in a way I rarely saw. The armor thinned just a hair. "You don't have to answer now," he said, which surprised me, because it sounded almost like care. I know what the world offers. I know men like me aren't ready-made for easing into it. A bitter laugh escaped him. I won't pretend I want something noble. I want you here. I want what you mean when you sit quiet and don't invite trouble. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I'm scared, he admitted, the word tasting foreign in his mouth. Scared I'll lose you and I'll be back to that field in my memory, without anything to hold. Hearing him speak like that, exposed, frightened, shook me. For months I'd convinced myself his soft moments were tactical, a way to keep me compliant. This was beyond tactic. This was confession. His voice broke on the last syllable, and for the first time I saw the man under the armor. Someone not invincible, someone who feared absence the way I feared violence. We stood in that quiet with the books watching like silent witnesses. Outside, men laughed, the world continued its routine. Inside me, everything tilted. I felt gratitude for the protection, shame at its cost, and something like pity for the jagged place he carried inside. I was tethered not only to his protection but to his fear of loss. The thought of being the balm for his old wounds was both sickening and strangely consoling. That night I lay awake in my bunk, the paper about my release folded beneath my pillow like a secret candle. I could feel the press of his words in my chest. If you stay, you belong to me completely. The sentence felt like a door with two handles. One leading outward to a life I barely remembered. One inward to a thing that wrapped around me so completely I could hardly breathe. I turned the decision over in my head like an object to be inspected. Each angle offered sharp edges. The logic of leaving was simple and pure. Reclaim a life, answer to no one, relearn ordinary things like sleep that doesn't listen for footsteps. The logic of staying was tangled and human. He had shaped me into someone who could survive here, and in doing so, he'd become the center of my days. Sleep did not come. The ceiling above me was a blank white I scraped with my eyes. Freedom glowed on the other side of the bars like distant sunlight, alluring and uncertain. The bond he'd built around me hummed like a low, constant chord. I could hear both calls, each one compelling in a different currency. And there I lay between two worlds, unable to reconcile them, unable to choose. The morning the bus was due, the block felt like it had been rewired. Lights came on earlier. The guards moved with a practiced briskness, as if any dawdling might unravel the whole plan. I woke before dawn, heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the whole tier. My hands shook as I folded the plain clothes they'd given me, shirt, jeans, a jacket that smelled faintly of other people's lives. I'd packed the small bag I'd been allowed weeks before. A few toiletries, a letter or two from my mother, a photograph folded until its edges were soft. The paper about the release was tucked into the inner pocket like a prayer folded against my chest. Walking to the gate felt unreal. The concrete stairs under my feet seemed to lead not just out of prison but into the rest of my life. A life that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Men I had shared meals with nodded at me awkwardly, offering small words of congratulations that sounded like they belonged to strangers. Some clapped me on the back with rough hands, sincere or not. Others avoided eye contact as though the thing I was doing was not to be spoken of aloud. Even the guards kept a slightly lighter cadence to their uniforms that morning. He watched from the yard in the same place he always did, a shape carved into memory. He leaned against the wall as if the concrete itself supported him. His face was unreadable, and yet I could feel the weight behind his stare like gravity. He didn't approach. He didn't wave. He simply watched, and in that watching I felt the measure of what he would lose. When it was time to be processed out, my hands trembled as they cuffed me one last time. Not the same clink that had landed me here, but the final click before the gate. A guard led me to the gate where the bus idled like a long, patient animal. The sunlight outside seemed impossibly bright, too clean after months of fluorescent haze. I took a breath and tried to steady my legs. He was closer now, by the back gate where the yard met the path to freedom. For a moment I feared he would step forward and block my path the way a sudden landlord might block the door of a tenant about to leave. But he didn't. He waited, hands in his pockets, jaw set. The two of us were aware of everything in those small seconds, of the scraping of a tire, of a distant guard's laugh, of the rusted hinge on the gate. "You sure?" he asked finally, voice low. No theatrics, no pleading. Just the raw demand of a man who needed an answer. My throat tightened. I think so, I managed. The words came out thin. I had rehearsed more eloquent speeches 1,000 times in my head. Imagined how I would tell him why I had to go, how I would promise to return or to send letters, or to explain that freedom felt like oxygen I had to breathe. None of that stopped the dry, empty panic that laced my chest. He stepped closer, and for a moment I let the memory of his touch, so often a small, steadying thing, wash over me. If you go, he said quietly, and his voice broke just slightly, you will walk out that gate and you will be free. You can be inside the world that doesn't care about the rules here. He looked at me then, full and searching. But if you walk out, no, it won't unmake what happened. You'll leave the walls, yes. But you won't leave me. I swallowed. There was no accusation in his tone, only fact. He tilted his head, studying my face as if etching it into somewhere safe. Then he reached out, fingers brushing my cheek the briefest fraction of a second. An almost apology, a benediction. Go if you must, he said, softer now. But know you'll always be mine. The sentence landed like a physical thing, heavy and impossible to dismiss. It could have been a threat, a tender plea, or simply the truth of the bond that had tethered us. I felt it as all of those things at once. For one split breath I considered staying, folding myself into the predictable rhythm and accepting the narrow sanctuary I had under his watch. I thought of the way other men gave me space now, how a single word from him sent predators away. I thought of the small kindnesses that had become the scaffolding of my days. But then I pictured my mother at the bus station, how she'd pressed a coin into my palm before I left and told me to come home. I pictured the smell of real rain on grass, the absurd smallness of a coffee shop in the city where no one would call me wife in a sneer. I pictured a life where the worst thing I had to fear was a bad day at work, not fists or marks of ownership. The picture lanced through me with a bright pain. Tears came then, unbidden and hot, and I surprised myself by not wiping them away. He didn't flinch. Maybe he had expected them. Maybe he had watched them from the first day when I had walked into the van. He let me be in the small space of my grief without explanation, without command. I have to try, I said. My voice was a whisper that felt enormous in the open air. I can't stay because it's easier. I have to see if I can be more than what I became here. Words failed me at the final clause. It was easier to gesture clumsily at the walls, the yard, the syntax of my life. He nodded slowly. His eyes looked like a map of things I had not imagined. Places where he had been hurt, places he kept locked away. Then go, he said. His jaw worked as if chewing something bitter. Go and be messy and weak and brilliant and never come back if you don't want to. Live badly if you must. Just live. He stepped back, as if giving permission in the only way he knew how. The guards unclipped my cuffs. The world suddenly felt louder. The hiss of the bus engine, the bark of orders, the rattle of baggage. I slung the small bag over my shoulder and walked toward the gate. For a heartbeat the door seemed too narrow, as though all the world could fit through it only if I condensed myself small enough. I turned for one last look. He stood where he always did, calm and unreadable until the moment our eyes met. In that glance I saw the man whose presence had been my shield and my chain. He lifted his chin once, an almost imperceptible salute, then returned to his wall as if there was nowhere else for him to be. The bus ride felt like a dream. The yard shrank behind a streak of glass, then a band of highway, then a blur. My hands curled around the strap of my bag until my knuckles whitened. The city unfolded in ways that felt both terrifying and wildly alive. My phone, an old flip my mother had given me, buzzed with one message: welcome home. I closed my eyes and let the city sounds wash over me, strange and sharp. Freedom was everything I had imagined and more. The taste of cheap coffee that didn't taste like metal, the sight of people who had never seen me in a uniform, the ordinary banality of a bus full of strangers who didn't know my history. But in the pleasant, mundane moments, something tugged at the inside of me. The memory of a hand on my shoulder, a command spoken softly, a claim made in a yard. I found myself flinching sometimes at the wrong noises, catching myself walking with the posture he taught me, fingers instinctively adjusting the collar of my shirt.